And so if you've fed entire databases into AI, it's somewhat difficult to protect that data after the fact.
Yeah, I got to imagine it's immensely difficult to then try to get all that information out of the models.
I don't know how you would.
Yeah.
I mean, realistically, based on how the generative AI models train, I don't know how you get them back. Most of the companies that I'm defending in litigation or in a regulatory investigation, that started because there was a misunderstanding about one of those three things. Well, I also think a lot of people don't understand how that pixel actually works, right? So if you have Facebook running in an app, or you've logged into it on your browser and you've just closed it, you haven't logged out, that pixel still fires. And it continues to fire and be read on every other website where the pixel is installed. So I think you think it's not a lot of data, but it's a lot of data.
Hey, Winter. So thanks so much for joining the podcast. As a way of
Yes,
getting started, give us a little intro. Who you are, what you do.
sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Wynter Deagle. I am a partner at Shepherd Mullen in the privacy and cybersecurity team. And my practice is primarily privacy related litigation and counseling.
So let's go back. It seems like privacy really started making headlines in like 2020, 2019. We really saw a lot of companies, some of their privacy practices got exposed in not the best way. And even if you look at like some of the pollings back then, big tech, the public trust had really fallen. But let's go back to the beginning. So it sounds like as digital technologies kind of came around, privacy really at the start, really most people weren't thinking of. And for a while, it was pretty much just kind of unregulated. Really weren't any laws that were applicable to it. Let's talk a little bit about kind of how it started, go back to kind of when it started, when it really started becoming regulated and getting into the public spotlight.
Sure. Well, it's funny. If you look back in the annals of privacy, the first time someone started writing about privacy was actually 1890 when Justice Brandeis wrote about the right to privacy, the right to be left alone. But if you look at how we then ignored it essentially for nearly 100 years, what ended up happening was you had laws that regulated certain parts of privacy, right? You have the Fair Credit Reporting Act that comes in that talks about your credit reports, or you had very specific areas that were regulated. Where privacy started to get some attention is when you started to see data security incidents, right? And so that was something that I think started companies and regulators thinking about, wait a minute, companies have a lot of data and interesting things are happening with it. It's getting disclosed to people that perhaps shouldn't have it or have access to it. So we should probably take a look at that. That starts, of course, as everything privacy related does in Europe. And you start with the first comprehensive privacy law kicks off with Europe's GDPR, which, started being discussed in 2015, 2016, and ends up going to effect in 2018. So you have a long period of time really where privacy for a lot of companies was really an afterthought. If they weren't dealing with criminal records or they weren't in the middle of a cyber incident, it wasn't something at that point in time that was getting a ton of attention. Some companies were focused on it, but many companies, particularly smaller companies, just weren't.
It still seems like today, to some degree, there's a pretty big variation in how companies look at security, or sorry, look at privacy and security. But in this case, specifically privacy, as far as what data they collect, how they retain it, and kind of what rights they give to their end users regarding their data, which some state laws have started coming into play, as well as GDPR, like you mentioned. Give us a little bit of insights into kind of some of those laws. It seems like there's two frameworks, meaning like the opt-in and the opt-out. Give us a little overview as far as what those two laws look like, or two, I guess, frameworks for laws look like.
Sure. So, opt in is sort of how we refer to the European based laws, right? So, in Europe, if someone is going to be collecting your data, using your data in a particular way, you have to opt into it. That's why when you're visiting Europe and you visit a website, every website has a cookie banner that you have to either accept, reject, or modify. The reason for that is because in Europe, they're not allowed to actually collect your data until you agree to it, right? And so when you look at how cookies and things that run on websites actually work, nothing is supposed to fire or start collecting data until you collect accept. In the US, for the most part, it's the exact opposite under a lot of these comprehensive laws. You have to opt out. So essentially, that's why a lot of websites in the US don't have a cookie banner, or if they have a cookie banner, you can navigate the website without making a selection. And that's because the US primarily is an opt out jurisdiction. There are some exceptions to that for children's data if they intend to sell children's data and things like that. But for the most part, I can collect your data in the US and use it in the way that I've disclosed in my privacy policy, unless you tell me not to.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it seems like one thing that's kind of problematic with that is there's so many different companies collecting data that it's hard to know, I guess, who is in order to opt out. Let's talk a little bit about some of the some of the data privacy lawsuits that have come about. It seems like the FTC has been enforcing companies' privacy policies. If they don't enforce them themselves, they'll take some sort of action against. Can you talk a little bit about maybe a story or two about some of those and kind of how they originate and how they settle or end up?
Sure. So, right now, the FTC seems really focused on health privacy. If you take a look at the actions they've taken recently, they're really focused in a lot of how are people's health data being collected and used, and are the companies that are collecting your health data actually following the procedures that they've laid out in their privacy policy. The thing that I take away from a lot of the recent enforcement actions, if you look at the enforcement actions that have come into play as a result of the use of tracking technology on healthcare websites, right? There's been a few of them, GoodRx and others. Um, a lot of it had to do with not being upfront about what was actually occurring or making promises that you weren't keeping, right? I think the one thing all regulators have in common is that if you make promises about privacy, they expect you to keep them. And so the main area that I see enforcement happening is where a company makes very robust promises about how they treat data, the privacy protections that they provide, what you're allowed to do with your own data, how you can control what they do with their data. And then those promises perhaps aren't strictly adhered to. That is when I'm seeing a lot of regulator action. Now, what spawns that happens in different ways, right? If you look at the issue involving the tracking technology, that grew out of a really interesting news investigation by the Markup, where they were talking about how many healthcare entities had the Facebook Pixel installed on their websites and how the Facebook Pixel was functioning with respect to health data. Prior to that, the FTC wasn't particularly focused on that. So if you look at what is driving regulation, some of it is business practice and some of it, quite frankly, is public opinion.
So you mentioned the pixel for people that aren't super familiar. That's essentially like a piece of embedded code that picks up, who's visiting the websites or even opening the email and things like. You talk a little bit about kind of what that practice is.
Sure. So I think most people commonly refer to it as cookies. Um, it's not really cookies. Cookies was generation one, which was like a small image file or text file that would be embedded, right? And it would transfer data back and forth. We're now in what I call the 2.0, which is pixels and code packages that are installed on websites by a website operator that collect data about your visit to the website. So some of the cookies or pixels tracking technology that is used It's used for the functionality of the website. So for example, when I go on to Nordstrom, it remembers my account. It knows what my shipping preferences are. Those are kind of the performance or the functionality cookies. Other cookies are what I would call analytics or advertising cookies. And what they do is, depending on how they're installed and how they're configured, they may track you on the website you're on. It may track you on other websites. And what it does is sort of collect information about your behavior on the site, how long you spend on certain pages, where you navigate to. And then if it's an advertising cookie, it will feed you ads for companies that have paid for those advertising services. So let's say I'm, Acme company and I've paid for the advertising cookies. You start on my website, but then you go to one of my competitors. While you're on the competitor sites, one of the ads you may get is a site for my company. That's how the cookies generally function from an advertising perspective. The Facebook pixel is like that. It is an advertising and an analytics cookie. It tells the person that has installed it a lot about your behavior on their site. And then if they're paying for the additional service, you can serve them ads later.
That makes sense. It sounds like, as far as many of the major tech companies, Google, Meta, Twitter, some of the other ones, that they've made a policy of trying to keep the data internal and shifting their advertising to people essentially buying ad space versus selling the data like a data broker. But there's definitely still businesses where their business model is being a data broker, which I gotta imagine the state privacy laws haven't made them happy.
Probably not. I mean, I think, look, if you're a company that is seeing where this is going, you have to be evolving your business model over time, right? Now in California, we have a data broker registry where people can sign in and see which companies act as a data broker and opt out of the sharing of their data, right? So if that is the business model, it is going to force change in how a lot of companies operate. Change isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? Innovation can be an amazing opportunity to use privacy as a business differentiator and a value generator. It's just going to force the change.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely seems like a value generator in the sense like a lot of people use Proton Mail or they do pay attention to the reputation. Like Apple, for example, has really shifted its brand to being a privacy centric company.
Apple's a great company to use as an example, right? They sell, for lack of a better word, privacy. It's part of their marketing scheme, it's how they differentiate themselves from competitors. Companies that are doing privacy really well can market it and sell it.
What about as far as the data brokers and how they're shifting? Because that pretty much is their business model, is to acquire data and then sell it to advertisers and sometimes people for companies for other purposes. How are they shifting their business model? As it seems like that business model, if you continue doing it, will soon be obsolete, especially as more and more states are passing laws.
That presumes that people actually exercise their privacy rights, right? And in my experience, that happens a lot less than you might think. While a lot of states are rolling out these laws, if you look at the ratio of people that are eligible to exercise their rights and people that actually exercise those rights, those ratios are very low. So I'm not sure that it's going to actually have an immediate impact on the way that they do business or the profitability of the business. Now, I think the forward looking companies and the smart companies are thinking about how to entice people. How do we make it worth your while to allow us to continue to collect and use and sell your data? That's where I think this is going, is more return for the people whose data is being collected, but I don't necessarily, at least at this point, see much of an impact on the industry overall.
Okay, that's interesting. That actually does make sense. I remember I was talking to some friends a while back, and they were asking me, they work in cybersecurity, they're asking me about data collection. I was telling them, like, a lot of companies now, they have like a blanket privacy policy that says that if you request them to delete your information, they will. Let's talk a little bit about the some of the privacy policies, because it does seem like a lot of companies are taking it more seriously. and putting stuff in there that they may not be required to by law. For example, I live in Arizona where there's not any comprehensive data privacy law. But if you go to a lot of websites of the company and click their privacy policies, it does say that they'll allow you to request your data to be deleted. Is that becoming? Is there a kind of a framework that you're seeing regarding privacy policies around for either different industries or just different, I guess, views on privacy?
I think it's coming down for two reasons, right? If you're doing business in any of the states that have passed these comprehensive privacy laws, and there's, 13 of them now, five are in effect, but we're rolling out over time. That is going to be the way that you have to do business, right? Where I think it gets interesting for companies is how do you deal with the fact that you're now giving some of your customers, some of the people that you want to trust you with your information, more rights than you give others of your customers? So, what we're starting to see is a trend in some industries and with some companies saying, you know what, I'm going to give these rights to everybody. You can have this control over your data if you choose to. And for some of the companies, they are making that sales pitch towards we are a very privacy friendly company. We're not doing anything shady. We don't engage in sketchy behavior with data. We're going to tell you exactly what we do. You can choose to allow that or not, right? Very privacy forward, very pro customer in that regard because you're providing the same rights to everybody. That's not required though. So other companies are taking a much more, this is what the law requires, and so this is what I'm going to do approach. And that's why in some privacy policies, you'll see if you are a California resident, you have the following rights. Or if you're a resident of Virginia or Colorado, you have the following rights. But they don't extend those rights to everyone. So we're starting to see trends emerge where companies are falling into these different camps. Now, some companies, right, aren't subject to any of these laws. The laws are mainly intended to target what I would say would be large companies that collect and use large sets of data, right? So if you look at how California applies to a company that collects personal information that has over $25 million in a single year in revenue. That's not really a small company. It's not a small business, right? Or it can apply if you're buying or selling or sharing the personal information of 100,000 or more California residents. So we're not talking about small nonprofit companies or tiny companies, startups that don't use much with data. What these laws are really targeting is larger companies that are frequent users, collectors, and sellers, quite frankly, of data.
So that's a good point. I think one thing you mentioned a little bit earlier is all those companies are enticing people to give up some of their rights to privacy, which I think most people on the internet or most internet users, whether it's YouTube or Google, are pretty accustomed to a lot of free technology. A lot of it's pretty good technology for free. And the reason why it's been free is because of those advertising capabilities, which I'd imagine that there's been conversation at companies in the boardrooms or somewhere that they're going to start to have to charge for some of these things that have typically been free. And most people that since are accustomed to it being free would probably give up their right to privacy in order to continue getting free technology.
Well, if you think about it, right, some of that already happened in the non tech space. Think about the pharmacy. You used to be able to just go into the pharmacy with a coupon and then you'd get your dollar off, right? Now you have to enter your number, and all of the coupons are electronic. And if you don't enter your number, you don't get the coupons. That's because they're tracking shopping behavior and they're using the data to inform, what they do for stalking and how often they're going to display this kind of product versus that kind of product and what the demographics are around people that are buying cold medicine in November. So if you think about how this has transitioned over time, this isn't a new concept that you trade data for benefits or financial reward. It's just expanding to being a little bit more obvious. Grocery stores have been doing this for a long time. Pharmacies started to do it, I want to say, like 15 years ago. So if we think about the gradual trade of data and privacy for benefit, it's something that we've kind of been sliding towards across industries for a long time.
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess it's not all that new. I did see the other day that YouTube started a lot of companies. I use Firefox, which I guess off this is a proof of concept as far as their privacy standards. So a lot of companies, a lot of news articles will put this like pop up that you need to disable your ad blocker before moving forward, and YouTube does it, which made me think that it was maybe coming to a head.
Yeah, see, that's interesting, right? Because YouTube's revenue and how the creators get paid is primarily based on ad revenue. So if you have an ad blocker, right, you don't make them any money, either the creator or YouTube itself. And so for them to have a business at all, that's the business model. So you either evolve the model or you make it so people have to engage in that way or not use your free service. Um, Everybody's got the choice on that. Personally, despite the fact that I'm a privacy lawyer, you can have the ads on my computer. I don't care. But there are a lot of privacy advocates that feel differently, right? The reason we have the California Consumer Privacy Act at all is because of a privacy advocate named Alistair McTaggart. He felt very strongly about how his data was being used by social media companies. And that's how we ended up with a law that now impacts everyone in California. So I think you're right. More and more companies are looking at it and going, well, what do we do now if people start blocking ads or saying we have to delete their data? It's forcing change for sure in industries that previously were somewhat immune, right? It's going to be interesting to see how companies that have made a lot of money off of cookies and pixels and things like that, how they transition. Google has already talked about transitioning to cookie free, to where they don't have that tracking technology as part of the business model. So it's one of those things that as more and more of these laws get passed and as privacy starts to be more of a mandatory approach, companies are going to look for different ways to make money off of data. I think we're going to see more of a financial incentive approach. You give us your data, we give you something that is valuable in response. Whether that's money or discounts or access to certain services remains to be seen. But things don't stay free forever.
Yeah, one thing I it seems like they've invested quite a bit in tracking because they're very good at almost to like a level of like a forensics investigation. Because for example, I use like Firefox, I have an iPhone. I usually use Proton. It's not always on for VPN, but usually it's on. And for example, like I'm not signed into my like Google account on Safari. If I search something, sometimes I'll get an ad on Facebook, and I don't have any of those permissions turned on for them, and so it's like they're very good at what they do, taking a tiny, probably not that much data, and drawing the right conclusion from it.
Well, I also think a lot of people don't understand how that pixel actually works, right? So if you have Facebook running in an app, or you've logged into it on your browser and you've just closed it, you haven't logged out, that pixel still fires. And it continues to fire and be read on every other website where the pixel is installed. So I think you think it's not a lot of data, but it's a lot of data. Um, and part of it, I think, is there's been a little bit of a misunderstanding, both on the customer side, the business side, and on the normal average person side about how some of this technology works and what that means. That's no one's fault. It's just there's a misunderstanding and a misalignment between what is actually happening. I talk about that a lot with my clients, which is okay, but do you understand what marketing is doing and what that means? And for a lot of companies, the answer is, oh, we didn't realize that that was happening. It's gotten a lot of companies in trouble, right? If we go back to our FTC enforcement actions or lawsuits that we're seeing around collection of data, specifically around like wiretapping. That happened because people didn't understand how the technology actually worked and what was being collected and what that meant. It's not because companies are trying to violate people's privacy. I think it's purely about, oh, we didn't have to worry about this for a long time. And everybody just accepted that this is what marketing did. Now that's being challenged. And so companies and people are playing catch up with the difference between how they thought the technology worked and how it actually works.
Yeah, I imagine that's somewhat similar. So we do penetration testing full time, and a lot of times we'll
Yeah,
find some backdoor, some finding in the company. A lot of times the responsive leadership was like, I didn't even know we were doing that or had that, and it just kind of fell out of inventory or just off the radar. I imagine that's
right. You're doing a penetration test and you're like, oh, you have exposed endpoints. It's the same from the privacy standpoint. You have exposed endpoints from a privacy standpoint, but in part, it's because you didn't even know the endpoint was there.
yeah. I think a lot of it's kind of an organizational thing where there's just kind of the disconnect between like what like legal and leadership, and then what's going on in some of the different operations, whether it's like operations engineering or marketing.
I think that's true. I think it's true. We're seeing interesting risk that is created by silos, right? You see it in the privacy space, you see it in the cyberspace. When legal is in one silo and IT cyber is in another silo and privacy compliance is over here, and then we've got marketing, when those aspects aren't talking to each other, the company is really set up for not only data breaches but privacy breaches, because the left hand not only isn't talking to the right hand, the left hand doesn't even know the right hand is there.
Yeah, yeah, that totally makes sense. Um, I think more from a consumer standpoint, to jump back, you're talking a little bit about those pixels, which I guess even I assume that the way like an iPhone was architected, that it was kind of a sandbox. Each app was sandboxed, but apparently there must be some access to some information, probably like the network layer. Um, but even I guess even from a consumer standpoint, I'm just kind of taking the assumption that I can prevent some of the data, but I just have to assume that and accept that some data, no matter what, is just going to kind of fall into the hands of, maybe unless I move to California, is going to fall into the hands of advertisers and tech companies and whoever else.
I think you'd have to make a big effort to prevent any of the data, right? So you'd have to sign out of every app. You'd have to go incognito mode or whatever the equivalent is on your browser. You'd have to make sure that you're, for every cookie banner, saying no. So it does take a lot of steps to make sure you never share any data with anyone. Um, I think part of the analysis is, do you care about the data that is being shared or not? I think the other thing that people don't think about is, think about how many breaches of your data there have been. I think everybody assumes their data is worth a lot of money. You could probably buy my social security number for 10 cents on the dark web, which is probably the most valuable thing that I have, my social, right? So, as much as I think privacy is very, very important, and it's important for consumers to think about, it's important for businesses to think about, you also have to balance that with like a dose of reality as to, this was unregulated for many, many years. And your data is floating around out there somewhere. So if you're going to track it all down, that's going to be like a full-time job.
Mm-hmm. So actually, we have a couple a contractor that actually did. He hired a company to go track everything down. Apparently, there's companies that do that.
Did it work?
Apparently, I couldn't find much on them. Um, but usually, even in like a penetration test, just doing like the reconnaissance and research, we're able to find a lot of information about companies where maybe each piece isn't that valuable. When you start painting like a whole picture, um,
Yep.
it becomes more valuable. Which,
It's funny. It almost sounds like one of those spy novels, right? Where the person that's been a long time spy has gradually erased all of their presence everywhere. It's like Jason Bourne.
yeah, pretty much. But as we get to the end here, I'd be curious. what advice do you have for companies as far as implementing good privacy, and then for people, individuals, as far as protecting their privacy?
I think for companies, my number one thing is know the data that you have, where you've put it, and who you're sharing it with. Most of the companies that I'm defending in litigation or in a regulatory investigation, that started because there was a misunderstanding about one of those three things. They didn't realize what they had, or where they were getting it from, or where they had put it, or who they had shared it with. Um, we are no longer in a time where you can just collect everything and throw it wherever, right? You do have to protect people's information, both from a cybersecurity standpoint and from a privacy standpoint. And the number one way that your company is going to end up calling me or someone like me to talk about representing you in a litigation or an investigation, or even worse, a regulatory enforcement action, is because you didn't understand your data and how you were using it and how you were sharing it, and if you had permission to do that from people, right? So if I'm a company, I think the first thing I'm going to take a look at is what data do I have and how am I using it? And are the statements I'm making in my privacy policies or elsewhere, do they match what I'm actually doing or not? Because that is what the first line of defense. You can do a lot of things with data. You have to be honest about what you're doing and stick to what you've said you're going to do. And I think if I'm a consumer, you do have rights. You can choose to, you know, push forward with acting upon those rights if you want to. But if you don't, right, then you have to kind of assume that your data is going to be in a lot of places. And maybe you do have a heightened risk of a data breach impacting you. Although, as you know, because you work in cyber, data breaches happen even to the best companies that are very well protected. Not every data breach happens because a company hasn't implemented reasonable security. Sometimes they happen because there are very smart hackers that make a lot of money stealing data, right? And it is more profitable for them to hack companies than it is to work for a company defending a hack. So unfortunately, we've created an ecosystem for data where it is profitable for individuals and for companies to steal data or to cause data breaches or to use ransomware. So I think for individuals, the reality of the situation is you should take the steps that you want to take to protect yourself, but you can't assume that every company is going to 100% protect your data. That's not possible or realistic. So really what you should be thinking about as a person is, what do I care about? And what rights do I actually want to exercise over the data that I care about?
Yeah, I think that is a good point. A lot of times it comes down to what information are you just making available, um, that maybe you should be a little more strategic about. Here's information that I want to share that I assume maybe that I want to share, and if it gets breached, not the end of the world. Versus here's information that wouldn't be great, like trade secrets or something like that. If you're a company, maybe an entrepreneur, or just personal information, if you're thinking about it from an individual standpoint.
And AI really right now is the newest risk to that, right? People are putting all kinds of crazy things into Chat GPT, whether that's data from their employer, data about them personally, they're loading photographs of themselves into it. And I think people don't understand how all of that data gets used by the company that is providing the generative AI platform. And so that I think is the next area of privacy cyber exposure that companies and people are going to have to grapple with, which is you fed a lot of data to the AI model. What happened to it now?
Yeah, I mean, I think right now it seems like it's just a bunch of, I guess, somewhat similar to code and how those breaches happen, but it's just a bunch of like logic stacked on top of each other that basically has access to all this information. And for some companies, specifically databases. Um, It was actually funny the other day. I was at a cybersecurity conference, and some other penetration testers were talking about how they were using ChatGPT to write exploits or whatever. And one of the things they did is they would ask it to do it and say, "No, I can't do this," and it would say, "Well, I'm not using this for malicious purposes." And they'd be like, "Okay," and then it'd write the thing out, which like
Problem.
exactly, I feel like
Yes.
an easy way you could reverse engineer that process to trick it to giving up information it's not supposed to.
I was talking to someone at a conference recently. They said they had it write ransomware, doing the same thing, and I was like, "Oh, things are getting sophisticated." Um,
I can't say what ours was not sophisticated, but I think it just goes to prove that there's just some holes in it right now.
and that's, if you're a company, that's one of the things you do have to think about. Is this is a new area of exposure, both from a cyber standpoint and from a privacy standpoint. Are you taking action on that? Because probably 2 years ago, most companies didn't think about having to have policies and procedures around the use of generative AI, or think about which platforms they were going to allow their customers or their employees to use, right? If you go on LinkedIn or even on do a Google search, there are new companies coming out with AI models all the time. Most of those are actually just built though on Chat GPT. So you're actually feeding data to OpenAI. If you use that, you may just not realize it.
Then ask one more question that I am curious. What have you seen as far as privacy and regulation in AI? Because it seems like right now it's just the Wild West.
It is the Wild West. I think the first mover again is going to be Europe, right, with the European AI laws. But you've seen the Biden administration be very focused on it. I'm not super confident that our Congress, with as contentious as they are, is going to pass comprehensive AI legislation. So I think we're going to end up in a situation like we're in with the privacy laws, where it starts to be passed state by state. And so I think the best thing that companies can do to get ahead of it is to start thinking proactively about how you want to use AI and putting appropriate procedures, policies, and protections in place now, because otherwise you will be playing catch up on a state law by state law or international law basis. And starting from scratch is a little bit difficult. Like, there's no point closing the barn doors if the horses have run out already. And so if you've fed entire databases into AI, it's somewhat difficult to protect that data after the fact.
Yeah, I got to imagine it's immensely difficult to then try to get all that information out of the models.
I don't know how you would.
Yeah.
I mean, realistically, based on how the generative AI models train, I don't know how you get them back. I mean, the remedy there is algorithmic disgorgement, right?
Hmm.
But you have to sue to get that, or you have to have that company face a regulatory action where they order algorithmic disgorgement. That's a really harsh remedy. So I'm not sure you could get it back.
Yeah, it seems like with a lot of regulations, just in general, they're usually very backward looking. It usually not really a partisan issue, but most of the time, it usually something bad has to happen to kind of kick the hornet's nest and get them to act on it, or at least get the political will.
Yeah. And even if you think about a lawsuit, right? Most of the things that people are going after in a lawsuit is money. But if the data is your trade secrets, right? If Coke for some reason accidentally fed the recipe for Coke into an AI model, there's no amount of money that's going to replace that. And so companies, if we're talking about your trade secrets, your secret sauce, or whatever makes you a market differentiator, you do have to take some additional steps to protect that, knowing that most companies right now have a lot of employees that are using AI, whether that's permitted or not.
So who's liable for that? Say if something like that did happen, the company for putting it in, or the AI model that's now shooting it out, or the company who owns the AI model that's now shooting it out to everybody and reverse engineering it and whatever else they're doing, or the companies that are using that information from GPT. Say,
So let's say the company accidentally put it in, right? Oops. Are you really going to sue the company that just accepted it from you? You could, maybe if it was like malicious or to try to get it back, or maybe they'd cooperate with you. But if you didn't have any policies or procedures or protections in place, is it really anybody's fault but your own?
Yeah, not really. I guess it would be more depending on what they do with that information after they get it.
That's a little bit different, right? But again, if it's your secret sauce, is money going to replace that? You could sue them, but is money going to replace what happened? If that's what made you competitive in the market, and now I can enter a give me the recipe for Coke into Chat GPT and actually receive it, or my 11 herbs and spices from KFC, which I still think is addictive. Um, you know, that's what makes them the companies that they are. If you lose that into an AI engine such that anybody can find it, I'm not sure there's an amount of money that compensates for that. That's why, like, minding your employees and making sure that you have policies and procedures around what employees have access to and what they're allowed to use AI for is really important.
Yeah, I think it kind of falls into some of that shadow IT. Like Grammarly was a big one that was sucking up a bunch of information that probably shouldn't have, or they shouldn't have been giving it. Maybe is a better way to put it. Well, Clay, I really appreciate you coming on here. I know we're starting to get to the end here. So people want to find you for more insights. Where's the best spot?
The best spot to find me is you can find me on LinkedIn. My name is Wynter Deagle. Or you can find me on Shepard Mullen's website, www.shepardmullen.com. And I'm generally around if you'd like some help.
Awesome. This was great.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me.